What do you do when your own blood strips you of a $10 million trust fund on your wedding day? Just because you chose love over a cold corporate merger, my family thought leaving me with $0 and 24 hours to pack would make me beg for mercy. They were too blinded by billionaire arrogance to realize the modest man I just married was the ultimate nightmare about to destroy their empire. Hello, wonderful listeners of Maya Revenge Stories. And thank you so genuinely for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely disabled our monetization features, leaving us with zero budget to continue producing these narratives. If you find yourself captivated by today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can experience exclusive, deeply emotional true stories featuring a full cast of voice actors that we simply cannot make public on this platform. You can easily join our community by scanning the QR code displayed on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link provided in the video description or the pinned comment below. Now, let us begin the journey of today, and my name is Tabitha Hale. The grand ballroom was drowning in white roses and imported silk. It was a wedding reception that cost over $3 million, a dazzling spectacle orchestrated by my father, Arthur Hale, the ruthless chief executive officer of Hale Global. I stood there in a custom gown, 30 years old, supposedly experiencing the happiest day of my life. However, the icy atmosphere told a completely different story. My father did not throw this extravagant party to celebrate my union. He threw it to stage a public execution. The real tension between us had reached a boiling point exactly 3 days prior, when I officially refused to sign over the ownership of my green technology startup, Aerostream Dynamics. I built that company from nothing into a pioneer of clean logistics software. Arthur wanted to absorb it into Hale Global to mask the massive carbon footprint of his own supply chains. When I told him my company was not for sale, his eyes turned cold. He promised severe consequences, but I never imagined he would choose my wedding day to deliver them. The music abruptly stopped. The chatter of billionaires and politicians died down to absolute silence as Arthur stepped onto the main stage. He grabbed the microphone and looked directly at me with a gaze devoid of paternal warmth. "Tabitha," his voice boomed over the sound system, "you have made a choice today. You have chosen to align yourself with absolute mediocrity because you refuse to honor the legacy of this family, and because you dare to marry a man with zero ambition. I am making a choice of my own, effective immediately. You are stripped of all inheritance. Your $10 million trust fund is gone. You are cut off from the Hale family permanently. You are no longer my daughter." A collective gasp rippled through the room. The wealthiest people in the city stared at me, captivated by the sudden destruction of my life. I looked at the man standing beside me, my new husband, Elias Vance. To my family, Elias was an absolute nobody. He was a humble high school history teacher. He possessed no trust fund and drove a battered 15-year-old Ford pickup truck. My family viewed him as a parasite who had somehow tricked the wealthy heiress. They were entirely blinded by their own arrogance. They could not see the quiet strength in his brown eyes or the steady grip of his warm hand holding mine right at that moment. The humiliation did not end with my father, my sister, Chloe, and her excessively arrogant husband, Marcus, saw their opportunity to twist the knife. Marcus was the director of supply chain for Hale Global, a man who spoke down to everyone he deemed beneath him. Chloe sauntered over with a malicious grin. "Well, Tabitha, since you two are going to be living in the slums now, we thought you might need some financial assistance." Chloe sneered loudly. Marcus laughed, snatching the papers from her and throwing them directly at Elias. A shower of brightly colored supermarket discount coupons fluttered through the air, landing on his rented tuxedo. "There is 50 cents off canned beans in there, buddy," Marcus mocked. "You better pick them up. You are going to need every single cent to feed our little runaway princess. Now take your bride and get out before we have security drag you out." The cruelty was perfectly orchestrated. They wanted me to fall to my knees, cry, and beg Arthur for forgiveness. They expected me to surrender my company right then and there, but I did not shed a single tear. I did not utter a single scream. I looked at the colorful coupons scattered on the marble floor, realizing that despite all their money, they were the poorest people I had ever known. I turned to Elias. He did not look humiliated. We did not say a word to Arthur, Chloe, or Marcus. I calmly gathered the heavy train of my wedding dress. Elias placed his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me forward. Together, we walked out of that magnificent hall, our heads held high. Behind us, the high society crowd resumed their whispers, gloating over the spectacular downfall of the rebellious Hale daughter. They thought they had witnessed the end of my story. They had absolutely no idea that the modest man walking quietly by my side was the ultimate storm, and they were entirely unaware of the utter devastation he was about to unleash upon their precious empire. The morning after the wedding, reality hit with the force of an out-of-control freight train. Arthur wasted zero time executing his brutal punishment. By 8 o'clock in the morning, my phone was blowing up with frantic calls from my chief financial officer. Every single personal bank account under my name was completely frozen. My platinum credit cards were declined at a simple coffee shop. But Arthur did not stop at personal vindictiveness. He leveraged the massive corporate weight of the Hale global empire to suffocate my startup. He personally called the top-tier venture capital firms across the city, threatening to pull his lucrative investments from their portfolios if they provided even 1 single cent of funding to Aerostream Dynamics. My vendors backed out within hours. It was a calculated, brutal corporate starvation designed to make me crawl back to his office by sunset, begging for a position I had fiercely rejected. We had no choice but to pack whatever fit into the back of the 15-year-old Ford pickup truck. We left the downtown luxury behind and drove out to a cramped, run-down apartment on the gritty outskirts of Chicago. It was a completely different universe from the velvet-lined world I grew up in. The paint on the walls was peeling in large flakes, the heating pipes clanked constantly like heavy metal hammers, and the air always smelled faintly of cheap stale coffee and exhaust fumes. At night, the relentless wail of ambulance sirens and the angry shouting from the rough streets below vibrated through our thin, single-pane windows. There was no soundproofing, no secure lobby, and absolutely no financial safety net to catch us if we fell. However, I refused to break. I transformed the wobbly wooden kitchen table into my new corporate headquarters. For 18 hours a day, I sat in a cheap folding chair, staring at my laptop screen until my eyes burned and my vision blurred. I aggressively pitched my green logistics software to independent Midwestern trucking companies, local distributors, and anyone too small for Arthur to intimidate. I wrote complex code patches myself late into the night. I negotiated tight contracts over a prepaid burner phone while rationing our cheap instant noodles. The pressure was suffocating, threatening to crush my chest every time a new server invoice came due. I was fighting tooth and nail, utilizing every independent connection I had ever made, just to keep Aerostream Dynamics out of the bankruptcy courts. Through the sheer chaos of those grueling days, Elias was my absolute anchor. He never once complained about the drastic downgrade in his living conditions when the rusted plumbing under the kitchen sink burst, flooding our cramped space. He rolled up his sleeves and fixed it without a single word of frustration. He cooked simple, hearty meals, using heavily discounted groceries, making sure I actually ate while I aggressively typed lines of code. Every time I felt the exhaustion threatening to pull me under the dark water, I would look up and see him pouring me a fresh cup of coffee. He would listen to my frantic rants about cash flow deficits with an incredibly calm, steady presence. "Take a deep breath, Tabitha," he would say, placing his warm hands gently on my tense shoulders. "The storm outside is incredibly loud, but it will eventually run out of rain. Just keep building." Sometimes, in the quietest moments of the night, I would catch a warm, almost mysterious smile playing on his lips. It was a look of quiet confidence that seemed entirely out of place for a high school history teacher struggling to pay the monthly rent. It was as if he knew a profound secret about the universe that I had not yet figured out. My family made sure the psychological warfare continued unabated. Chloe and Marcus somehow tracked down our new address. On random Sunday afternoons, the deafening roar of a custom Italian sports car would echo through our narrow, trash-lined alleyway. They would park right outside our dingy building, purposely revving the massive engine to draw attention. I would peek through the dusty, broken blinds and see Chloe posing in expensive designer clothes in front of our graffiti-covered entrance. She would snap dozens of photos, laughing loudly so I could hear her through the thin glass. "Make sure you get the garbage cans in the frame. Marcus," Chloe would yell, pointing at our front door. "I want everyone to see where the runaway princess lives now." They would tag the location on social media with cruel captions mocking my new poverty-stricken lifestyle. They wanted to humiliate me globally, desperate to prove to their high society friends that abandoning the Hale name was a fatal mistake. They thrived on the arrogant assumption that my spirit was being slowly crushed into dust. But right as our financial runway shrunk to mere days, right when the monthly payroll was about to bounce and destroy everything I had built, the impossible happened. I was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 o'clock in the morning, staring at a negative bank balance, when a high-priority email notification flashed across my screen. It was a secure wire transfer confirmation from our corporate banking portal. I blinked hard, rubbing my tired eyes, genuinely thinking the severe exhaustion was causing visual hallucinations. An anonymous private trust had just injected $15 million directly into AeroStream Dynamics as an angel investment. There were no demanding board seats attached to the term sheet, no aggressive buyout clauses, just clean, unrestricted capital transferred through a highly secure offshore account. It was a monumental lifeline that completely flipped the board in my favor. I sat there in the dim light, staring at the glowing screen with tears of pure disbelief streaming down my face, completely unaware of where this astronomical sum of money came from, or who had just handed me the ultimate weapon to fight back. Exactly 6 months after I walked out of that suffocating ballroom, the very foundation of the Hale family empire began to fracture, while my startup quietly solidified its massive market position thanks to that miraculous $15 million anonymous injection. A dark and violent storm was brewing over the glittering skyscrapers of Hale Global. The insatiable greed that fueled their operations finally reached a critical mass, triggering a global legal and financial crisis that would shake the retail industry to its core. The catalyst for this absolute catastrophe was Marcus, blinded by his own immense arrogance and desperate to inflate the profit margins of his supply chain division. My brother-in-law had bypassed legal maritime regulations entirely. For years, he had been meticulously constructing a highly illegal, deeply embedded shadow network of international shipping routes. He routed massive cargo freighters through unauthorized ports, utilizing a complex web of offshore shell companies to obscure the origin of their materials. He blatantly violated strict federal anti-dumping laws by flooding the domestic market with cheap, undocumented textiles. More dangerously, he systematically evaded billions of dollars in import taxes. Marcus believed he was an untouchable genius, floating high above the law. He had no idea he was constructing a monumental house of cards. The collapse did not happen gradually. It happened with the terrifying speed of a synchronized military strike. The United States Customs and Border Protection Agency had been quietly building a massive federal case. Without a single warning, they initiated a massive takedown. Under the cover of darkness, hundreds of armed federal agents raided Hale Global offices across the country. They confiscated encrypted servers, seized physical ledgers, and locked down operations. Arthur received the devastating phone call at 3 o'clock in the morning. His frantic chief operating officer informed him that the government had placed federal hard locks on their largest distribution warehouses in New Jersey and California. Worse still, 9 of their massive international cargo ships were completely immobilized, physically chained to the docks at the Port of Los Angeles by direct order of the Department of Justice. The panic was instantaneous and absolute. When the stock market bell rang that morning, Hale Global shares went into a catastrophic freefall. The stock plunged an astonishing 42% in less than 4 hours. Shareholders were screaming, corporate partners were fleeing, and the terrifying shadow of a lengthy federal prison sentence loomed directly over my father and Marcus. Trapped in a corner, Arthur called an emergency session with his crisis management team. The corporate attorneys presented him with a desperate, nearly impossible exit strategy to avoid a grand jury indictment for systemic fraud. Hale Global needed to prove that their supply chain mismanagement was a legacy system error, not a malicious criminal enterprise. They needed to execute an immediate, massive digital migration. They had to port their entire tainted logistical database onto a transparent, meticulously clean, government-certified software platform. By cloaking their operations in a flawless, legally sound architecture, they hoped to confuse the federal auditors just long enough to destroy the most incriminating evidence. There was only one logistics software system in the entire country possessing the ironclad encryption and government compliance rating necessary to pull off a cover-up of that magnitude. It was the proprietary system built, owned, and operated by AeroStream Dynamics. To save himself from federal prison, Arthur desperately needed the exact company he had tried to destroy on my wedding day. My family knew perfectly well that I would happily watch their empire burn to ashes before I ever signed my technology over to them. Therefore, they resorted to the dark, psychological warfare they excelled at. My mother, Eleanor, stepped out from behind her country club facade to orchestrate a vicious shadow campaign. Recognizing they could not break me directly, she targeted my vulnerable flanks. She quietly funneled massive amounts of untraceable cash to dark web hackers and ruthless private investigators. Eleanor directed these mercenaries to launch targeted intimidation campaigns against the minor shareholders and angel investors I had brought on board during the early days of my startup. Her operatives dug up buried financial debts, intercepted private communications, and threatened to expose devastating family secrets. It was a calculated, brutal attempt to orchestrate a hostile board takeover from the inside out. Eleanor wanted to terrify my own allies into executing a vote of no confidence, removing me from the chief executive chair so she could snatch the company away. However, the federal prosecutors were moving with terrifying efficiency. The legal net was tightening by the hour, and Arthur simply ran out of time for Eleanor's slow-moving poison to take effect. Panic is a highly dangerous catalyst, and the sheer terror of losing his wealth pushed my father completely over the edge of sanity. Late one rainy Tuesday night, pacing frantically inside his deserted executive boardroom, Arthur made a fatal point of no-return decision. He summoned the highest-ranking corporate attorney on his payroll, a man whose moral compass was easily silenced by a massive retainer fee. Arthur slammed a heavy leather binder onto the polished mahogany table. Inside was a comprehensive, unconditional software franchise transfer agreement, drafting away every single patent and code of AeroStream Dynamics to Hale Global. The lawyer reviewed the documents, sweat beading on his forehead. Arthur, this document requires the verified, authorized signature of the Chief Executive Officer of AeroStream Dynamics. We do not have her consent. This piece of paper is completely useless. Arthur slammed his fist onto the table, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated desperation. "I do not care what it takes," Arthur roared, his voice echoing violently against the glass walls. "You have her old employment contracts in our archives. You possess hundreds of legal files bearing her exact handwriting. Replicate it perfectly. You will forge her signature on that bottom line tonight. Or I swear to you, every single executive in this room will be sharing a federal cell block with Marcus by the end of the week." Under the crushing, suffocating pressure of a collapsing dynasty, the legal team crossed the ultimate criminal line. With shaking hands, they projected my signature onto a light board, meticulously tracing the curves and angles of my name onto the bottom of the surrender document. They committed massive, undeniable corporate fraud, blindly believing they could steal my life's work to plug the massive holes of their sinking ship. It was exactly 11:45 on a violently stormy Thursday night. The relentless Chicago rain was hammering against the single-pane glass of our living room window, sounding like handfuls of gravel being thrown against the building. Elias and I were sitting in the dim light of the kitchen, quietly reviewing our server costs. when a sharp, aggressive series of knocks rattled our thin wooden front door. The knocks did not stop. They grew louder, echoing with a frantic urgency through the narrow, trash-lined hallway outside. Elias stood up smoothly, placing a protective hand behind my waist as I reached for the deadbolt. When I pulled the door open, the sight before me was so bizarre it felt like a hallucination. Standing in the flickering fluorescent light of our miserable apartment corridor were my father, my mother Eleanor, and my sister Chloe. Their expensive designer cashmere coats were completely soaked, dripping rainwater onto the cheap linoleum floor. They pushed their way inside without waiting for an invitation, instantly making our cramped living space feel suffocatingly small. They brought the cold, damp air of the storm in with them, along with an overwhelming stench of sheer desperation masked heavily by expensive perfume. Arthur initiated the performance immediately. His broad shoulders slumped, and he placed a trembling hand over his heart, acting like a broken man on the verge of a massive cardiac event. "Tabitha, my beautiful daughter," Arthur choked out, forcing a single, perfectly timed tear to roll down his weathered cheek. "I have made the most catastrophic mistake of my entire life. I have spent the last 6 months consumed by a bitter, poisonous pride. But the firm is facing a terrible abyss right now, and the stress has made me realize that none of the money matters. Family is the only thing that truly matters. I was a fool on your wedding day. I was terrified of losing you, and I lashed out like an absolute monster. Please, look at me. Look at your father. I am begging for your forgiveness." It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. If I had not spent 30 years studying his ruthless corporate tactics, I might have actually believed the agonizing sorrow in his voice. Before I could utter a single word, my mother stepped forward. Eleanor reached out, her diamond rings catching the dim light as she gently placed her cold hands over mine. Her voice was dripping with a sickly sweet, maternal warmth that made my skin crawl. "Darling, we cannot bear to see you living in this horrendous squalor for another second," Eleanor murmured, casting a look of intense pity at the peeling paint on our walls. "We want to make our family whole again. We are ready to buy you and Elias a beautiful $5 million estate in the prime northern suburbs tomorrow morning. We want to fully restore your $10 million trust fund immediately. We want you to come back home where you belong. Tabitha." Chloe nodded vigorously, playing her supporting role to absolute perfection. "Exactly," she chimed in, offering a fake, trembling smile. "We can forget all the ugly things we said. We just want our sister back." The hook was dangled, beautifully wrapped in millions of dollars and false affection. Arthur smoothly pulled a sleek black leather folder from inside his wet coat and placed it onto my wobbly kitchen table. "We just need to clear up a tiny bit of red tape to reintegrate your assets into the family holding company," Arthur said softly, pushing a gold-plated pen toward me. "It is just a standard internal procedural document, a simple formality to merge our software divisions so the board of directors can authorize the massive transfer of your trust fund. Just sign on the bottom line, sweetheart, and this nightmare ends tonight." I did not touch the pen. I pulled the heavy parchment paper toward me. The document was dense, printed in tiny, single-spaced font, buried beneath layers of complex corporate legal jargon designed to exhaust the reader into submission. But I was not a naive heiress anymore. I was a chief executive officer who had spent the last 6 months fighting for survival in the corporate trenches. My eyes bypassed the bold introductory paragraphs and locked directly onto the deeply buried indemnification clauses in Section 7. Paragraph 4. The trap was brilliantly hidden, but utterly devastating. The contract was not a simple merger. It was a legally binding assumption of absolute liability. If I signed my name, I would be retroactively appointed as the executive director of the Hale Global International Supply Chain for the past 48 months. The document explicitly stated that I, as the developer of the logistics software, had full autonomous control and total legal responsibility for all shipping routes and customs declarations during that exact time frame. They were not trying to save me. They were using my clean technology company to build a legal firewall around themselves, deliberately turning me into the ultimate scapegoat. If my signature touched that page, Marcus and Arthur would walk entirely free, and I would be the one facing 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive tax evasion and international smuggling. The sheer magnitude of their evil sent a wave of icy clarity straight through my veins. I stood up slowly, picking up the thick stack of legal documents. I looked directly into my father's expectant, teary eyes. I gripped the top of the pages tightly and violently ripped the entire contract straight down the middle. The sharp, tearing sound echoed like a gunshot in the tiny apartment. I threw the shredded pieces of paper directly into Arthur's face. "You did not come here to save your daughter," I stated, my voice dangerously calm and entirely devoid of emotion. "You came here to find a sacrificial lamb for your federal crimes. You thought I was stupid enough to absorb your prison sentence in exchange for a house. Listen to me very carefully. You are not my family. You are dead to me, all of you. Do not ever knock on my door again." The transformation was instantaneous. The sorrowful, weeping father vanished completely, replaced by the vicious, cornered corporate predator I always knew. Arthur's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He kicked the kitchen chair so hard it shattered against the wall. "You ungrateful, arrogant little wretch!" Arthur screamed, spit flying from his lips as he pointed a shaking finger inches from my face. "I built you, I gave you everything you think you are so smart, playing CEO in this filthy little slum. I will crush you by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will unleash the darkest, most ruthless forces of the Wall Street underground. I will liquidate your pathetic little startup. I will ruin your husband, and I will make sure you spend the rest of your miserable life scrubbing floors." Elias stepped forward silently, his imposing frame suddenly towering over my father, his eyes flashing with a silent, terrifying warning. Arthur took one look at Elias, swallowed his remaining curses, and stormed out into the hallway, followed closely by a pale Eleanor and a terrified Chloe. The door slammed shut, leaving nothing but the sound of the pouring rain and the shredded remnants of their pathetic trap scattered across my floor. At exactly 9 o'clock the following morning, the Manhattan skyline was shrouded in a thick gray fog. Arthur had pulled every string he had left to secure an emergency meeting at the global headquarters of Vanguard Logistics. Vanguard was an absolute titan in the maritime shipping industry, a ruthless international conglomerate, and the only entity on Earth possessing enough liquid capital to buy out Hale Global and save my father from a lengthy prison sentence. The entire Hale family rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 95th floor. They walked into the breathtaking glass-enclosed boardroom with their chins held high, desperately attempting to project their usual arrogance. They were fully prepared to grovel, to sacrifice whatever equity necessary to appease the notoriously cutthroat, anonymous chief executive officer of Vanguard. The boardroom was vast, dominated by a massive black marble conference table. At the far end of the room, the primary executive chair was turned away from them, facing the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling city below. Arthur, Eleanor, Chloe, and Marcus took their seats nervously, arranging their heavily doctored financial portfolios. Suddenly, the heavy double doors of the boardroom swung open. I walked into the room wearing a sharply tailored, charcoal gray power suit. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I completely ignored their stunned expressions and calmly took my seat in the chair specifically designated for Vanguard's chief legal counsel. The sheer confusion on their faces instantly morphed into vicious outrage. Arthur slammed his hands on the table, his face turning a familiar shade of purple. "What in the world are you doing here?" Arthur hissed, leaning across the massive table. "Did you actually follow us here? Are you so pathetic that you came to sabotage our last lifeline? Security is going to drag you out of this building in exactly 2 minutes. You are absolutely nothing in this room, Tabitha." Chloe laughed, a sharp, nervous sound. "She probably came to beg for a job in the mailroom. Marcus, Call the lobby and have this beggar thrown out onto the street before the chief executive officer arrives. You do not need to call the lobby. A deep, chillingly calm voice echoed through the massive room. The heavy leather executive chair slowly swiveled around. The silence that followed was so absolute, so suffocating. It felt as though all the oxygen had been instantly sucked out of the room. Sitting at the head of the table, resting his hands casually on the polished marble, was Elias Vance. The man they had relentlessly mocked, the humble high school history teacher they had thrown cheap supermarket discount coupons at, was gone. In his place sat the supreme ruler of Vanguard Logistics. He was wearing a magnificent, midnight blue bespoke suit that radiated absolute power and wealth. His posture was commanding, his brown eyes cold and unforgiving as they locked onto my father. Marcus turned completely white. His jaw dropped open, and he gripped the edge of the table as if the floor had suddenly vanished beneath him. Eleanor let out a strangled gasp, pressing her manicured hand over her mouth. Arthur looked like he had just been struck by lightning, his eyes darting frantically between Elias and me, his brain completely unable to process the catastrophic reality unfolding in front of him. "Good morning, Arthur," Elias said softly, his voice slicing through the tension like a razor blade. "I believe your son-in-law mentioned something about 50 cents off canned beans. Do you require any financial assistance today?" Elias did not wait for a response. He smoothly picked up a thick, heavy leather binder from his side of the table and threw it aggressively across the sleek marble. It slid and slammed violently into Marcus's chest. Hundreds of glossy pages spilled out. They were perfectly documented. High-resolution records of every single illegal shipping route Marcus had utilized over the past 5 years. Included were the offshore bank account routing numbers, the massive tax evasion ledgers, and crystal-clear satellite imagery of his undocumented cargo freighters. Then, Elias threw a second, thinner folder directly in front of Arthur. It flipped open to reveal the desperately forged software franchise agreement from the night before, highlighting my perfectly replicated, completely fraudulent signature alongside a sworn affidavit from the terrified corporate attorney Arthur had forced to forge it. "You came here hoping Vanguard Logistics would absorb your toxic wasteland of a company," Elias stated, leaning forward, exuding a terrifying, predatory dominance. "You are completely mistaken. I am the anonymous angel investor who injected $15 million into Aerostream Dynamics. With that same capital, my acquisitions team has spent the last 48 hours quietly buying up every single cent of Hale Global's defaulted debt. I do not want to merge with your company. I own your company. I am here to confiscate your entire existence." Arthur began to hyperventilate, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the undeniable proof of his total destruction. "You cannot do this," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual bravado. "We are family, Tabitha, please. Tell him. Tell your husband to stop this." I looked at my father with absolute zero empathy. "I told you last night, Arthur, you are not my family." Elias slid a single piece of crisp white paper across the table, along with a heavy gold pen. It was a complete, unconditional deed of asset relinquishment. "This document transfers every remaining share, every patent, and every physical asset of Hale Global directly into my holding company for the purchase price of exactly $1, Elias commanded, his tone completely devoid of mercy. "You have exactly 10 minutes to sign your name on that bottom line. If that pen does not move, I will make one phone call, and the heavily armed federal agents currently waiting in my ground floor lobby will breach those glass doors in exactly 60 seconds. They have the federal warrants for Marcus's international smuggling and your corporate forgery. The choice is yours. Arthur, sign away your empire, or rot in a federal cage." The heavy gold pen shook violently in Arthur's hand. He stared at the single piece of crisp white paper, fully comprehending that his massive legacy was about to be reduced to absolutely nothing. With a suffocating gasp that sounded like a dying breath, he pressed the nib to the paper and frantically scrawled his name. For the purchase price of exactly $1, the retail empire of Hale Global was officially erased from the economic map. Arthur collapsed back into his leather chair, burying his face in his trembling hands, completely broken by the loss of the only thing he truly ever loved. The ink was barely dry when the heavy glass doors of the boardroom violently burst open. Elias had never intended to let them walk away cleanly. A dozen armed federal agents flooded the room, their silver badges flashing under the bright lights. They bypassed my father entirely and moved straight for Marcus, before my arrogant brother-in-law could even utter a single word of protest. Cold steel handcuffs were securely fastened around his wrists. He was dragged out of the room facing a multitude of federal financial fraud charges, leaving Chloe screaming hysterically on the polished marble floor. The fallout was swift and incredibly brutal, with all their corporate assets instantly seized and their personal credit cards permanently frozen by the government. My parents and sister were unceremoniously evicted from their sprawling estate. Stripped of their wealth and abandoned by their high society friends, they were forced to relocate to a cramped, deeply unpleasant unit in the exact same suburban slum they had visited just to mock me. They became prisoners of the very poverty they had so viciously weaponized. Later that evening, away from the sheer chaos of the corporate takeover, Elias finally explained everything. He held my hands gently, confessing that he had kept his billionaire identity a heavily guarded secret because he desperately wanted to find a woman who loved him for his heart, not his massive bank accounts. He wanted someone who would stand by him in the darkest of times, and I had proven my absolute loyalty when we had absolutely nothing. I wasted zero energy gloating over my fallen family. Instead, I immediately absorbed the remaining salvageable infrastructure of Hale Global and completely restructured it. I merged their physical supply chains with the clean technology of Aerostream Dynamics, ultimately forging the single largest sustainable logistics network in all of North America. Despite our astronomical wealth, we never sold that tiny, noisy first apartment. Today, Elias and I are sitting on its rusty balcony, sipping hot coffee from cheap ceramic mugs. We watch the busy city below us with quiet, contented smiles. The storm has finally passed, leaving behind a crystal-clear truth: absolute power does not reside in arrogant boasts or cruel screams. Real power is the quiet, unbreakable ability to master the game while the rest of the world makes noise. Thank you so incredibly much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where in the world you are tuning in from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you found today's journey compelling, please help keep this channel alive by joining the Maya Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our most spectacular, fully voiced, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can join us right now by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the description or the pinned comment. Stay strong, and I will see you in the next story.